some terrific experts. Aurora Meadows is a registered dietitian and has been staff nutritionist at EWG for the last 10 years. Aurora works on EWG's food scores, which is our database of more than 80,000 foods rated by their nutrition, ingredient, and processing concerns. She has also researched thousands of food additives present in our food supply and can decipher pretty much any of the alphabet soup of additive acronyms you may want to throw at her today. And we're also joined by Dave Andrews. Dave is a senior scientist at EWG, where he uses his background in chemistry to investigate public and environmental health issues. And in particular, his research has focused on industrial chemicals, nanomaterials, drinking water contaminants, and food additives. After we hear from Aurora and Dave, we want to hear from you. So if you have a question or a comment, put it in the comment section of your Facebook page so you can join the conversation. So, Aurora, what is titanium dioxide?
Thanks, Scott. Titanium dioxide is one of the top 50 most commonly used additives in food. For the most part, it is manufactured through a synthetic chemical process, and it can be derived from a naturally occurring mineral called rutile. More commonly, though, it's found in ilmenite, which is a mineral that contains both iron and titanium. Titanium dioxide itself is a white pigment used to color foods, and it's extracted through a chemical process that uses either sulfate or chloride, so it's technically a synthetic color.
And so it's used in food as a color. What kinds of foods is it typically found in?
So lots of foods popular with children, like cupcakes, candies, Skittles, Starburst, Sour Patch Kids, Little Debbie's snack cakes, Hostess donuts, Jell-O, and 3,000 other foods. More interesting, though, is the foods you won't find it in, particularly pet food at Petco. In May of 2019, it was banned from foods sold in all of their stores. And I know that the FDA, and you know that the FDA is often underfunded and lacks the resources to carry out its mission. But even for me, it's sometimes hard to stomach the fact that my 9-year-old cat is more protected than my 9-year-old son.
And so, Dave, tell us more about the safety issues around titanium dioxide. Why is the European Food Safety Authority reviewing the safety of titanium dioxide?
Well, so the European, and thanks, Scott, the European Food Safety Authority is actually re-reviewing the use of titanium dioxide in all food additives, really. They're systematically going through all the foods added, or all the ingredients added into foods, and evaluating whether or not they're safe for use. And so they were recently re-reviewing the safety of titanium dioxide in food, and they could not identify a safe exposure amount. And part of the reason they couldn't identify a safe exposure amount was because they evaluated new data concerning the potential for titanium dioxide to damage DNA. And it was that potential to damage DNA that really led to this conclusion or opinion from the European Food Safety Authority that they couldn't identify a safe level of exposure and that it shouldn't be used in food because of that. And so the next step in Europe is a proposed ban, but that's a little bit down the road. This opinion just came out in the last few weeks.
And we're joined also by Professor Paul Westerhoff from Arizona State University. Thanks for joining us, Professor Westerhoff. You're right on time, because one of the things that EFSA concluded about titanium dioxide was that that nanoparticles, that titanium dioxide nanoparticles might impact our DNA. Can you tell us a little bit more about what are nanoparticles and why do they matter?
Yeah, thanks for having me join in. Sorry about being late. Yeah, so titanium dioxide and other nanoparticles are in a lot of the things we put on our skin, that we eat every day, and a lot of our personal care products, and a lot of the things that make our life better, but also society better. So, I mean, some of the things that make society better are some of the catalysts and catalytic converters. The things then in our food, like titanium dioxide, are in a lot of powders and other things that give things texture, keep them dry, give them color, give them nice smooth texture, on your tongue. So, these things are put in for, enhancing kind of the experience in preserving or eating the food. So, there's been a number of studies that show the types of food that these are in. We did one that's showing, a lot of candies, sweets, and things that it added to for texture. So these titanium dioxide nanoparticles are small, of course, right? And a lot of the food grade titanium dioxide that is in our products, it's not all really small, right? So an operational definition is smaller than 100 nanometers. So most of the food grade material that we've been eating for decades have about a third of the titanium dioxide particles, less than about 100 nanometers. So we've been eating this stuff for a while. It's just this definition now that draws this line of what is nano. I don't know if that helps.
Well, and I think a lot of folks who are watching are wondering, is there something unique about titanium dioxide nanoparticles that has caused EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, to now conclude that they're no longer safe for use in food as a way to make food certain colors? Is there something unique about these particular nanoparticles and how they interact with the body that would cause concern about health effects?
Right, and so a lot of the food-based titanium dioxide, they're not meant to be really small. It's kind of just a size distribution. So when they mine this material or when they synthesize it, it's a size range, and there's a tail that's down in this range. It's really, other types of products that we use that have titanium dioxide, which are really engineered to be a certain size. So sunscreens, for example, have titanium dioxide because it absorbs UV, A and UVB light that could give you sunburn or skin cancer, but they also want to be clear, right? In terms of, not cause a lot of white stuff on your nose. So by making them smaller, it makes them not visible when you spread it on your skin. So it's really the food material is somewhat accidental that it's there. It's not there to have any certain function.
And so, Dave, what has the FDA had to say about the safety of titanium dioxide?
So the FDA approved titanium dioxide for use as a colorant for food in 1969. And as far as we know, that there's been no public reevaluation of the scientific evidence on whether or not it's still considered safe. And so part of this is we're highlighting how the FDA doesn't really have a systematic process to re-review the use of food additives and consider the recent scientific studies. And so that's what makes this issue somewhat interesting. And actually, the EFSA decision to reevaluate the use of titanium dioxide in food was partially based on some of the new regulations and recommendations in Europe to consider the nanoparticle size materials of titanium dioxide. And so they did highlight, while they aren't the smallest size particles that are the most reactive that are used in catalysts, there is some understanding that as the particle size gets smaller, there's greater reactivity. And when they incorporated some of the scientific studies that actually looked at health effects, they couldn't find a bright line where a certain particle size was necessarily safe. And when they incorporated in that greater evidence of reactivity and potential for DNA damage, they said we really can't identify a safe level that could be used in food. And as has been mentioned earlier, it's not a necessary ingredient. It's there to enhance the experience, brighten the colors, really make it more appealing to consumers, but not necessarily adding anything nutritionally.
And you're saying that FDA, unlike EFSA, FDA doesn't believe or hasn't ultimately, as a matter of policy, gone back and looked at decisions that were made in the 1960s to continue to ask, are these ingredients safe? Is that right?
Right. There's no process to go back and reevaluate that safety. And part of this is some of this consideration and some of this new understanding that's come in the last few decades in terms of what size particles may be in titanium dioxide. Do some of those particles interact with our bodies in ways that we hadn't anticipated? And what was actually an interesting part of the EFSA research was that they actually characterized all the different types of titanium dioxide on the market and found significant differences actually in the amount of nanoparticles in the different materials that different companies were selling. But they still couldn't necessarily say that one was preferential over another.
So Aurora, you mentioned that at the beginning that Petco is not allowing titanium dioxide in cat food, which is great news for our cats as well. But is titanium dioxide allowed in organic food?
So no, if you can regularly afford and make it work within your budget to buy organic, then no, you don't have to worry about titanium dioxide being in food. Because it isn't allowed in organic foods because the organic regulations prohibit nearly all synthetic ingredients. Since titanium dioxide is largely manufactured again through that synthetic chemical process, it's not allowed.
And we talked about how the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, is doing a sort of looking back at the safety of titanium dioxide and other food chemicals. Does USDA review the safety of these the synthetic chemicals that are allowed in organic? How often does that happen?
Yeah, so the USDA reviews not only the human health impacts, but also the environmental impacts of the synthetic substances that are added to organic foods every 5 years. And again, like we said, the FDA never has to review the safety of food additives, even when new science reveals potential health risks. And so our question to the FDA is, if the USDA can do it, why aren't they?
Right. Well, so now we want to bring our viewers in, and we've gotten some great questions in the chat. A lot of folks are asking about whether this is the same white stuff that we use to protect our skin from sunburn. That sounds like a question for you, Dave.
Yeah, or Professor Westerhoff. I think it's relatively similar. They may be slightly different particle sizes, but it's effectively the same ingredient.
It's also.
Go ahead, Aurora.
Oh, I was just going to add in that it's also used in gessos and primers and paints to kind of, prime that wall for that uniform color before you add the color on top, which is essentially what it's also being used in to do in food.
Yeah, a lot of the, titanium dioxide in sunscreens, these can be creams or also sprays, right, that you can inhale if they're aerosols, and versus pumps, which are more of a liquid. Each of those kind of, have the potential to lead to different exposure routes. Inhalation and even the liquid spray versus the aerosol spray can get deposited differently in your lungs. So it is very different than ingesting food, but then the material itself is also quite different. So the titanium dioxide in sunscreens will be titanium dioxide, anatase, rutile, or brookite, other specific minerals, but it'll almost always have a coating on it. And that coating may be a polymer coating. It may be a small layer of aluminum, a small layer of silica. And for two reasons. One is such that it can be mixed in with the creams and becomes, again, very kind of homogeneous and smooth and not gritty or agglomerated. And two, that if titanium dioxide just sits out in the sun, it's what's called a photocatalyst. So it would react with sunlight and it produce what are called hydroxyl radicals. So you need some type of coating over that so that doesn't happen, because that would damage the skin. But in general, they're much smaller, on average, about 10 times smaller. They're more in the range of 5 to 20 nanometers, whereas the food grade material is more like 80 to 500 nanometers. So much smaller, same mineral, just very engineered much more closely.
So if consumers, one question we're getting is, how can people avoid products with titanium dioxide? Aurora, if folks wanted to shop around this problem, how could they do that?
Obviously, reading ingredient lists. I know that's not always people's favorite thing to do. So we have EWG's food scores through our Healthy Living app. I believe that's right? And you can use it to scan the barcodes of foods and will highlight any ingredients of concern. So that's kind of a simpler way to do it.
Yeah,
And-
we've done a number of studies where we actually go shopping and we look at the labels, and a consumer would see usually one of two things. Either it'll say titanium dioxide, or it might say colorant E171, which is a code for the colorant. And what we found is we bought products with and without it, and all the ones that labeled it had titanium dioxide. There is a threshold below which they don't need to label it. I forget the exact amount. I think it's about 1 weight percent. Don't quote me on that number, but you can put in a small amount. But pretty much all the ones that had it actually had it. And we bought similar products that were also, say, white or powders. And the ones without it actually don't, for the most part. There was one exception from Australia that we actually found titanium dioxide in one that wasn't labeled. So I agree with Aurora that, that labeling, is pretty transparent in terms of if it's going to be there.
I think maybe you were talking about food contact substances. That's the other use for titanium dioxide as well. So that would be a case where it wouldn't actually be labeled, but the concentration is probably much smaller.
Well, and we got a question about that as well. Is someone was saying there are certain food chemicals that are labeled because they're directly added to food, and then there are other food chemicals that migrate from the packaging into the food. And someone was asking, is titanium dioxide one of those chemicals that might migrate from the packaging into the food? Do we know, Dave or Professor Westerhoff or Aurora?
Go ahead, Dave.
Sure. I mean, titanium dioxide is also commonly used in food contact materials. It's approved for use. It makes a lot of the white packaging because it provides that same feature of bright white color. And in terms of overall exposure, the exposure is going to be much lower, even if you have some migration, being that it can be used up to 1% in foods. Very different exposure amounts. It likely does come out in a small amount, likely measurable, but probably insignificant compared to these foods where it's directly added.
And in addition to the food contact, I think, as Dave said, is probably small. There's lots of these exposures. Paint, toothpaste, actually has quite a bit of titanium dioxide in it as well. So of all those different exposures, which can be much higher, some pharmaceutical pills will have a combination of titanium dioxide and other things for both protecting the materials inside, but also serving as a desiccant to keep it dry, to keep the active ingredients active. But I think all those are much lower exposures than things like toothpaste and food that you would ingest, at least into your gut.
And one more question, which is, does it just, if it's used in a cosmetic or a sunscreen, does the titanium dioxide just sit on the skin? Does it migrate through the skin into the bloodstream? What do we know about what happens to the titanium dioxide once it's applied to the body?
Sure. The most comprehensive studies have been done by the Food and Drug Administration, actually, and looking at skin absorption of titanium dioxide. And they found that, at least in sunscreen applications, healthy skin, there's no measured absorption of titanium dioxide. There's potentially at least migration slightly deeper into the skin in damaged skin, but that evidence was actually still quite low. And so the available evidence we have to date is that it does pretty much sit on the surface of the skin. There's little to no absorption into the body. And we actually recommend it as one of the sunscreen ingredients. That's definitely a reasonable choice.
But of course, if you eat it, then it obviously has a very different effect on the body.
Yeah.
I guess last question is just, I think this is for you, Dave, is just what should FDA have done? You said earlier they haven't reviewed the safety of titanium dioxide since the 1960s. Someone else is commenting that that's true for many food chemicals that we eat every day. What should the FDA do?
I mean, they really need a systematic process of incorporating modern science into their evaluation of all food additives. Our scientific understanding of chemicals, our body, how different agents interact with our body has changes and evolves over time. And we need just really a straightforward process where all that new science, that new information is incorporated into our food additives, and the safety and evaluation of those. So at this point, we're really just calling on the agency to review all of this scientific evidence. And the bar is high for food additives. There's a standard of they should be generally recognized as safe. Right. And based on this new information, we think they should reconsider that and really just look at the evidence.
Yeah, and I think it's the case that the burden is on FDA to prove that these chemicals are safe, not the other way around. That it's not, the burden's not on us to prove they're unsafe. Ultimately, the burden's on FDA to continually prove that they're safe. But or at least there's a reasonable certainty of no harm. Oop.
I thought there was a cat walking around. There's some white on that cat. So I would add to that a little bit from the generally regarded as safe. I think there is a need to understand how much titanium dioxide people are ingesting. So one is the overall risk is a function of exposure and hazard. So I think in terms of actions that they could take is they have various food baskets that represent consumer intake and different demographics of consumer intake, different ages of people consuming them. So these representative food baskets, I think, would really help the FDA understand exposure levels, right? So, we were talking about, sunscreen on your skin versus eating the sunscreen. So your exposure is much less if you don't eat it, right? And then there's a benefit of it. So while I do agree they should assess the hazard, the danger of the chemical, anything's always, the dose tells you about the poison. So I think these food baskets would be another way for them to understand exposures to this and, to titanium dioxide and other materials that have been generally regarded as safe.
I'd like to add on that, just from a perspective of a mother of a 9-year-old, and I see the middle school kids hanging around the convenience store and all their little candies that they're having after school every day. I'd like to see a food basket of that to look at those exposures, and I know that exposure has changed since the 1960s and pretty significantly. So it would be nice to see a more representative current day evaluation of that.
They actually do a pretty good job with these food. I think there's something on the order of 20 different food baskets, if I'm not mistaken. So they do try to capture these different, use patterns of different age groups, different demographics.
Obviously, they haven't looked at it since
your children.
1960, though.
All right. Well, thank you so much for those of you who are joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thanks to our expert, Professor Westerhoff, for joining us in particular. Thanks all.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.